Recognizes Mr. Hefner to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Senate Bill 763, that's what we're on, right? Okay. Will simply provide an avenue for those with proven skills in advice and mediation, chaplains, to serve at a Texas public school without needing to be recertified by the state. And I believe we have some amendments.
The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Tallarico.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tallarico to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this first amendment that we have provides a definition for chaplains, and it would define chaplains as a person who is endorsed by an organization recognized by the United States Department of Defense, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And I believe that this
Mr.
one
Speaker.
is acceptable to the office.
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for
The
questions?
gentleman yield for questions.
I yield.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Representative Tallarico. I think it's so important that you are proposing an amendment to create some guardrails, just like we have guardrails for everybody we let into our schools to interact with our children. That's what you're doing with this amendment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we know that there are some unscrupulous characters who don't have our kids' best interests at heart, and we want to ensure that those people aren't having access to our kids in our schools, inside our schools. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
I appreciate your amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I move adoption.
Mr. Tallarico has the amendment. The amendment is acceptable. The author's objections to the adoption. The amendment, the chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Toth, for what purpose?
I rise to call point of order against further consideration of this amendment pursuant Rule 11, Section 6.
Mr. Toth, the amendment was adopted and is accepted by the author. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Wu.
The chair recognizes Mr. Wu to explain the amendment. Mr. Toth, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to call point of order on the bill.
Mr. Toth, we're on the amendment. As soon as we take this amendment, you can call your point of order on the bill. The chair recognizes Mr. Wu to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment simply says that public funds for public education should stay in the public realm, that if these chaplains are to be compensated, it should come from private sources, come from private organizations, and we should not use public monies to compensate religious services. Move adoption.
Mr. Wu sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Members, thank you. This just completely messes up the purpose of the bill. We want schools, if they so choose, to be able to hire chaplains or accept them as volunteers. And so I ask you to oppose this amendment.
The chair recognizes Mr. Wu to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill itself says these are volunteers. Now, I'm not sure what everyone's definition of volunteer is, but to me, volunteer is someone who does not accept compensation for what they're doing. If we're now saying that, no, we actually intended to compensate these chaplains to do this work, then they're not really volunteers, are they? So if you want this bill to say that these are actually volunteers who are giving their time and efforts for free to help schools and help students, then you need this amendment. If not, then we are saying that these are not volunteers in reality. I urge you to vote yes on the amendment.
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose? Mr. Wu sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. King and Hempel voting nay, Mr. Hefner voting nay, Mr. Wu voting aye, Mr. Tallarico voting aye, Mr. Toth voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 59 ayes, 77 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Talarico.
The chair recognizes Mr. Talarico to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment would require parental consent before a child can meet with the chaplain on campus. This session has been all about parental rights, so this would just ensure that parents are protected in this process, and before they meet with a school chaplain, they would have to receive that parental consent.
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, I
Gentleman
yield.
yields.
Thank you. Appreciate your amendment about parental consent. We know, especially when it comes to religion, we should defer to parents for that permission when it comes to having that kind of access to our kids. Is that the aim of your amendment?
Yes, that's what I believe. I think that's what most members of the body believe.
Another part to your amendment that I really appreciate is the standards for conduct for a chaplain. We want to ensure that all faiths are appreciated and welcomed by this chaplain who stands in a position of authority in our schools, and that chaplain refrains from proselytizing or imposing the chaplain's values or beliefs or religion on a student. That's what your amendment says. Isn't that correct?
That's right. This amendment does not gut this bill. This amendment does not undermine this bill. All we're trying to do is add some belts and suspenders to this bill and make sure there are appropriate guardrails to protect our students. Like with many things, we require parental consent before a child can participate in a program or meet with a certain adult on campus. We're just applying those same guardrails to this legislation.
I appreciate those guardrails, especially because one of the groups that came before our committee that was pushing for this bill was a group that has as its stated purpose to enhance, quote, his presence by infiltrating the system and supporting Christians functioning and operating inside the school system, which I believe to be unconstitutional and not appreciated as a parent, that our schools would be indoctrinating our kids on any kind of religion. And so I appreciate that. The second part that I have seen of this organization that's pushing this bill, it says from their profile on their website, the strategy is simple: leverage one of the largest networks on the earth, the existing school system, and utilize government funding along with your donation to teach Jesus in the classroom. That's unconstitutional, isn't it, Representative Talarico?
I believe it is, and I think we should all be concerned with any organization whose stated purpose is to infiltrate our public schools. Like many of you, I believe education should be about just that, education, and not indoctrination. And I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, I think we can trust our school districts to make the decisions on the regulations that they'll put on our chaplains. We currently don't do these kind of regulations on our school counselors, and this has in here for the Department of Education to establish regulations, and I want to leave it with the school districts.
Mr. Talarico, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for
The
some
gentleman
questions?
yield for questions.
Sure.
Gentleman yields.
Representative Hefner, I want to thank you. You and I have engaged in good faith, thoughtful conversations about this legislation. Consider you a friend and thankful that you've engaged with me on those conversations. I know we agreed on the First Amendment that we added. The Second Amendment you're opposing, and I just want to try to understand why you're opposing it and have that conversation in front of the body. Are you aware of the National School Chaplains Association?
I've heard of them.
They testified in favor of the bill both in the House and in the Senate. Have they helped you at all with this bill?
We had several different people supply input that we talked to. I don't remember those specifically.
Are you aware that the stated purpose of this organization is, quote, to enhance his presence by infiltrating the system and supporting Christians functioning and operating inside the school systems?
I'm not advised. What I'm aware of is that what this bill does is allow school districts to determine whether or not they want to allow chaplains as hired or volunteer personnel.
And I appreciate that that's your purpose. I'm worried about the organizations that may try to take advantage of this, including any organization that's attempting to, quote, infiltrate our public schools.
That's why this bill is permissive and would allow the school boards to establish their own rules.
And that's why a few moments ago we added another amendment that was acceptable to you, which would define what a chaplain is to be in alignment with the Department of Defense standards. Is that correct?
Correct.
And thank you for accepting that amendment. Representative Hefner, do you think we should encourage the infiltration of our public schools?
I think we need to give our school districts every tool that we can in the toolbox with all that we've been experiencing with mental health issues and catastrophes and crises. Our schools need to have every tool available to them, and this is just another tool.
I want to ask about the amendment that's before us, which requires parental consent before a student can meet with a chaplain. I know, Representative Hefner, that you are a champion for parental rights, so I'm just curious why requiring parental consent before a student can meet with a chaplain is not acceptable to you in this legislation.
Well, we currently do not require parental consent for them to meet with school counselors, and again, school districts will be free to establish any kind of rules and regulations regarding how the chaplains would conduct themselves.
Do you believe a chaplain has the same qualifications as a school counselor?
I don't know that they would be performing all of the duties that a school counselor does, but I do believe they're quite qualified to help with life issues and challenges that may be facing our students and teachers. And so I think they'd be more than qualified to fill these roles.
So to be a school counselor in Texas, you have to have a master's degree. Are we requiring that school chaplains have a master's degree in this bill?
I don't believe so.
School counselors have to teach in Texas public schools for 2 years in a classroom before they can be a school counselor. Are we requiring that chaplains teach in a classroom for 2 years before becoming a school chaplain?
In the definition of the chaplains that we had before, chaplains go through extensive training through all kinds of issues that they deal with. And again, like I say, this is permissive. Schools can require what they see fit.
So, Representative Hefner, I agree that some chaplains go through extensive training. As you know, I'm a student currently at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, where I'm studying alongside students who are going to become chaplains in our hospitals, in our prisons, and our armed forces. They are getting a master's degree in divinity and going through extensive courses in counseling and training for counseling. But I want to clarify that not all chaplains have to go through that type of rigorous training. In fact, I'm looking at the website of the organization I mentioned earlier, National School Chaplains Association. They admit on their website that the training is, quote, minimal. It includes a 48-hour program that's equivalent to 1 college credit. That doesn't sound extensive to me. Does it sound extensive to you, Representative Hefner?
Well, a school could very well require their chaplain to become a board-certified chaplain. And some of the requirements there are essential requirements for certification include endorsement from your faith tradition, a master's degree from accredited theological school, at least 4 units of CPE, post-training, clinical pastoral experience, preparation of clinical materials, and face-to-face appearance before a certification committee. So there again, I want to make sure that we're making it clear that everybody knows that the schools may choose to do this or not, and that they can put whatever rules and regulations in place that they see fit.
So why don't we add to your legislation that chaplains have to meet those high standards before dealing with our students or serving our students in Texas public schools?
Because I think, just to be blunt with you, I think we can trust the school boards to do that right there.
Representative Hefner, part of the amendment that you're opposing would require school chaplains to undergo a background check.
Can you repeat that, Representative Tallarico?
Members, please take your conversation outside the rail.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hefner, the amendment that you're opposing, my amendment, would require chaplains to undergo a background check, which is required for most of the adults who work in our public school system. Is there a reason that you're opposing that part of the amendment?
Again, I trust my school boards to make those decisions. Your amendment also requires that the Education Commissioner and the TEA establish rules of conduct, and I'd rather see that happen at the local level.
So you don't want to require in your bill that chaplains have to undergo a background check?
I want to leave it to the schools to make those decisions. school boards.
And just to make sure I'm clear, because we've talked a lot about parental rights, you don't want to mandate that schools have to receive parental consent before...
Representative Tallarico, I have full faith and trust in our school boards to put regulations in place that would keep our kids from being exposed to dangerous people.
I appreciate that, Representative Hefner. I think my primary concern is that by not putting these guardrails in this piece of legislation that we're going to add our name to, that will allow organizations like the National School Chaplains Association, whose stated purpose is to infiltrate our system, to take advantage of your legislation and infiltrate our public schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bernal, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for a couple
The
questions?
gentleman yield for a couple questions.
Just a couple.
Yes, just a couple. And I want to get to the text of the bill if we could. The first is it says that a school or a district can hire a chaplain. Does that mean that each campus would be limited to one?
No, we dug into that, Representative Bernal, because I was concerned about that a little bit. But from my understanding, that they would not be limited to a single chaplain, and I wanted to make sure that the schools could have as many as they thought was necessary.
And so my second question then would be, under your bill, is it possible that any campus could replace all of their counselors with just chaplains? Could you have campuses where the only support employee on site is a chaplain, but not a counselor or a social worker or a school psychologist or a family specialist?
The way this bill is drafted, and the intent of the bill is to allow the schools the option to have chaplains in place of or alongside the counselors.
So just to be clear then, and I want to make this clear to the body, that the answer then, and this is not a gotcha moment, but the answer then is yes, that the way that the bill is crafted, a school board could opt to have no counselors, no family specialists, no school psychologists, and replace them entirely with chaplains.
Representative Bernal, I trust our schools to make the right decisions in those areas. I don't think they would do that. And I think we ought to trust our school boards and superintendents a little bit more than that to make the right decision here.
And I believe that you believe that, and I have no doubt that the vast majority of districts would do that. But I guess my question is, theoretically, that is possible. It is possible that
I guess if the schools thought that that was a necessary thing, they could make that decision.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Speaker.
Yeah, I noticed.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tallarico to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. This amendment is being brought forward in good faith. I'm not trying to undermine Representative Hefner's bill, not trying to gut his bill. I'm trying to put in place common sense guardrails on this piece of legislation to ensure we are protecting parents and protecting kids. Like I said, we have done a lot of talk about parental rights during this session. We have passed legislation requiring parental consent for a lot less than meeting with a religious official on campus. I can't find a reason why we wouldn't require parental consent for a student to meet with a religious official in one of our public schools. We had, maybe until tomorrow, we had a member of this body who was a youth minister. I would hope we would submit any person like that to a background check before meeting with our school officials or with our students, and that's what this amendment does. I urge you to vote yes on the amendment.
Mr. Tallarico sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. This is a record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Show Mr. Tallarico voting aye, Mr. Hefner voting nay, Mr. Toth voting nay, Ms. Hinojosa voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 61 ayes and 76 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Wu.
The chair recognizes Mr. Wu to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is a simple common sense addition to this bill. This bill allows people of faith to work in their schools. All this is saying that, hey, we recognize that not only do we have a diversity of faiths in this state, but there's a diversity of denominations within our faith. And there may be students who say, like, look, I want to talk to somebody, but I want to talk to somebody within my own denomination, whether that be a Catholic priest or a Muslim imam or a Jewish rabbi. They should have the ability to request it. And all this amendment says is, hey, if a teacher or a student requests this, please allow them to bring in somebody else that they're comfortable with.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner in opposition to the amendment.
It's clear in the bill and that chaplains do not push certain denominations, so this is not necessary, and I ask you to vote no.
The chair recognizes Mr. Wu to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, you know, I love being up here and setting records for future litigation. So this simply says that we're going to respect all faiths, all denominations. If schools want to bring in one denomination, one specific faith, and you have students and teachers who say, look, could we have an additional denomination? Can we have an additional faith? Because otherwise there's a monopoly by one group. And all this is saying that, look, if students, parents, teachers would like another denomination, would like another faith to be present as well, that we do that. This is not a difficult thing. This has not gut the bill. This does not hurt anything. It allows more choice. It allows more freedom. It allows more liberty. How can you be against that?
Mr. Chair, for what purpose?
To ask the gentleman some
The
questions.
gentleman yield question.
I will.
He yields for questions.
So, Representative Wu, all you're saying is that if a person is comfortable with one faith tradition, they've been raised in a church, a temple, a mosque, or not at all, that they simply can request that faith tradition and opt out of the faith tradition that is being offered by the school. Is that all your amendment says?
Absolutely. And you know, as you well know, that different faiths have different philosophies about how to interact with people, different traditions about the understanding of the world. And if your students are having a hard time, if students are having a difficult time with life, maybe they're traumatized, maybe they have problems at home, they might appreciate someone who also understands their viewpoints, understands where they come from, understands their faith. This is not a difficult thing to do. This is not a difficult thing to ask for, to simply, hey, I'm more comfortable in my denomination, in my faith. Is that so much to ask for?
So both my daughters were raised in the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
And if a school district brought in members from a non-Christian faith tradition, and my daughter said, hey, I'd prefer to have sort of a Catholic priest who would counsel me, they would be prohibited from doing that under this, and instead the school district or the school would mandate to them that they must receive counseling from a pastor, a chaplain in the faith tradition of the government?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Bernal, for what purpose?
this gentleman yield for a question.
The gentleman yield for questions.
I will.
Representative Wu, I want to ask sort of what Representative Anchia was asking from a different perspective. My understanding is that the bill allows for both the hiring and the volunteering of a chaplain. And is it your understanding that if your amendment doesn't get on, then people from other faiths, a rabbi, imam, etc., would not be allowed or be prevented from volunteering at a school for their services? So it's not just that someone, let's say like my daughter, who's Jewish, could not receive counseling or services from a rabbi, but that willing, qualified rabbi would not be allowed not only to be hired, but would not be allowed to volunteer, because the bill considers both employment and volunteers. Is that right?
Absolutely. So in a sense, just as our discussion and our discussion with Chair Anchia, in essence, if we do not take this amendment, as school districts that make a choice about which faiths, which denominations will be present in schools are by default creating a state-sanctioned religious indoctrination, if that's what they wanted to do. Because no one else could come in. No one else could request something different. So if you are Catholic, you are Protestant, you are Lutheran, or if you are a Muslim, or if you're a Buddhist, or if you're Jewish, think carefully about your vote on this. Think carefully about what you want our children to be able to request for them to receive in these troubling times when our kids have so much trauma in their life. Simply letting them ask for someone that they're comfortable with, for someone that they feel understands their background and understands their worldview. That's not a big ask. That's not a big requirement. And in this day and age, it's not hard at all to find anyone of any faith to come in and say, hey, I'm happy to talk. That's it. We're helping our kids and making sure all of our kids get what they want and not necessarily what the school board or the school forces down their throat. I urge you to vote yes on the amendment.
Mr. Wu sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs in the adoption of the amendment. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Wu voting aye, Mr. Hefner voting nay, Mr. Smith voting nay, Mr. Toth voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 59 ayes, 78 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Hinojosa.
The chair recognizes Ms. Hinojosa to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill says that we cannot allow chaplains who have a background of being a sex offender, convicted sex offender, into our schools. I believe it's acceptable to the author.
Ms. Hinojosa's Senate amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption amendment, the chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Zwiener.
The chair recognizes Ms. Zwiener to explain the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a very simple amendment that removes one of the more problematic elements of this bill. If you turn to page 3 of this bill, you'll see that Section 3 requires every school board and every governing board of a charter school to vote affirmatively on whether or not they are going to bring chaplains into this school and into their school district under this provision. Members, I have never seen us do anything like this, where we force a school board to affirmatively vote up or down on the record on a proposal like this. And I really have to ask myself, why do we think that is a good idea, to require our school districts to vote? I'm concerned that it's a provision that's going to end up causing consternation in our communities. If we remove this, it still leaves control in the hands of individual districts if they want to do this or not, but it doesn't force them to take a record vote if this is not a direction they want to go as a board. So members, I would encourage you to consider supporting this amendment, keeping unnecessary drama out of our school board meetings. Goodness knows they have had enough drama the last couple years, and let them focus on educating our kids instead of risking potentially pulling them into some unnecessary conflicts within their own communities. Y'all see the conflict we are having here on the floor today. I don't want that conflict to be happening in my school board meetings in my district, and I don't think y'all want that either. So I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, as y'all can tell up here, these members are kind of coming at me at the last minute, and so I haven't really had a chance to look at them and think through them. We want to leave this bill as is, and I please ask you to stick with me.
Mr. Speaker.
No.
Ms. Zwiener, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
Would the gentleman yield for questions?
Sure.
The gentleman yields.
Representative Hefner, what is the value of asking every school board in the state to vote up or down on this?
I don't think it's a problem to know where they stand on the issue. And that's the way this bill was drafted, and we worked it all the way through the process, and I'd like to keep it like it is.
So is the intention to try and cause some type of consternation in some of our districts if they don't want to pursue this?
No.
So then why not just remove the provision so that individual school districts don't have to vote on this?
Well, like I said, we worked this bill pretty thoroughly through the process in an open and transparent manner, and I think it's not too much to ask to have people make a decision on it.
Representative Hefner, do you understand my concerns about some of the drama that might cause in school districts across the state if you do have a local divide over this?
No.
You don't share my concern that the challenge and conflict we're having in this chamber today might bleed over into our schools when they really need to focus on the important work of educating our kids?
No.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was mine.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Weiner to close on the amendment.
Members, there is no good reason to compel every school board in the state of Texas to vote on whether or not to bring chaplains into the school. There is no reason to force every governing board of every charter school in the state of Texas to vote on this. All it is doing is inviting dissent and controversy into our school boards for no reason. Now, some of y'all represent school boards where this won't be any controversy, but some of y'all, like me, represent diverse communities with diverse feelings about religion and diverse communities with many faiths represented, where this is going to be yet another cause of tension. In the years following our districts having to navigate COVID, having to navigate increased attention on libraries, having to navigate increased attention on every single aspect of school business. Our schools are struggling. We are struggling to have people who are willing to step up and run for school board because it has become an unpleasant situation for many of those folks. In every single district I represent, I have school board members who have received death threats because of how hostile and how much conflict we have had around our school boards. So let's not pour any more fuel on that fire, members. Our children need us to pull our districts back from culture wars and let them get more focused on what's really important, educating our children. So members, please support this amendment to make sure our school board members can focus on what's important. If we adopt this amendment, every district in Texas can still vote to have chaplains if they want. But if they don't want to, this bill lets them not, or this amendment does not make them vote. So I ask for your support, members.
Ms. Weiner sends an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the authors. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Mr. Hefner voting nay. Mr. Toth voting nay. Mr. Talarico voting aye. Ms. Hinojosa voting aye. Ms. Weiner voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 57 ayes, 80 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The chair recognizes Ms. Niave Criado for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I move that the House grant permission for the Committee on County Affairs to meet while the House is in session today at 4 p.m. in room 1W.14 Agricultural Museum to consider pending, referred, and committee business.
Members have the motion. Is objection? Chair hears on this order. The following announcement, the clerk read the announcement.
The Committee on County Affairs will meet today at 4 p.m. in room 1W14 Agriculture Museum in a formal meeting to consider pending, referred, and committee business.
The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Hinojosa.
The chair recognizes Ms. Hinojosa to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. What this amendment does is ensure that these chaplains are subject to background checks since they have access to our kids in our schools. Move adoption.
Ms. Hinojosa has sent an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption amendment. The chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner to close on the bill. Mr. Wu, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I move to reduce to writing all conversations on this legislation and place in the journal.
Members heard the motion. Is objection? Chair has done so. The chair recognizes Mr. Hefner to close on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage.
The question occurs on passage of the engrossment of SB 76. Passage of the third reading of SB 763. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Mr. Hefner voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 84 ayes, 54 nays, SB 763 is passed the third reading. Mr. Hefner moves to lay HB 3614 on the table, subject to call of objection. Chair has done so ordered.